Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into the Salton Sea today, um, California's largest lake, and it's shrinking and like really fast.
Yeah, it's a pretty big concern right now.
So, like, what's going on here? Why is this happening?
Well, the main issue is that there was this policy decision to divert water away from the Salton Sea,
Oh, okay.
and that's causing it to shrink at like a crazy fast rate.
Huh. So it's not like a natural thing. This is like a human-caused problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. So what are the consequences of that? What happens when a lake shrinks that quickly?
Well, as the lake shrinks, it exposes the lake bed,
Right.
right? And that lake bed is full of all sorts of pollutants from years and years of agricultural runoff.
Right, right. For our listeners who might not be familiar, can you explain what agricultural runoff is?
Sure. So it's basically the water that flows off of farms, after it rains or when they irrigate.
Uh-huh.
And it carries with it all these fertilizers, pesticides, all the chemicals they use in
Oh,
farming.
so it's like a toxic soup, basically.
Pretty much. And when the Salton Sea was at its normal level, this runoff was diluted and trapped under the water, right?
Okay.
But as the lake shrinks, all this nasty stuff gets exposed and it dries up and turns into dust.
So it becomes airborne.
Exactly. And people breathe that dust in.
Oh, that's not good. And what are the health risks associated with that?
Well, this dust is laden with pollutants that can cause all sorts of problems, respiratory problems, cardiovascular issues, even increase the risk of certain cancers.
Yikes. So we've got this shrinking lake problem caused by water diversion, leading to toxic dust and serious health risks. This is heavy stuff.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this rapid shrinking was discovered by the local community, right?
Yeah.
Using like balloon mapping.
Yeah. It's actually a really cool story.
Tell me more about that.
So residents were seeing these changes in the lake and they were getting concerned, obviously.
Right.
And they decided to take matters into their own hands. They attached cameras to balloons and sent them up 200 feet in the air. Yeah. To capture images of the shoreline over several years.
That's so creative. I never would have thought of that.
It's a really ingenious way to document the changes, especially, over a long period of time.
So why balloons? Why not like drones or something?
Well, drones would have limited their coverage. They'd have to keep recharging them.
I see.
Balloons, they can stay up there for much longer.
Makes sense.
And they cover these huge areas, giving them a much more comprehensive view of how the shoreline is changing.
That's really smart.
Hmm.
But it's also kind of sad that they had to resort to these DIY methods to get attention to this problem.
It is, but their efforts have been invaluable because by comparing these balloon images with satellite data from way back in 2002, researchers from Loma University were able to measure the shoreline retreat super precisely.
Okay, so let's talk numbers then. You mentioned earlier that the lake is shrinking at a really alarming rate.
It is. So before they started diverting the water in 2017, the shoreline was receding at about 12.5 meters per year. Okay.
But after that policy change, that rate jumped up to almost 38.5 meters per year.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. We're talking about a projected shoreline retreat of 150 meters by 2030 and another 172 meters by 2041.
Oh my goodness. Those are some scary numbers. So this balloon mapping project, it wasn't just a feel-good community effort.
Right.
It actually provided crucial data that helped quantify the problem.
Exactly. And without that data, who knows how long it would have taken for people to realize the severity of the situation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It makes you wonder, what other environmental issues are flying under the radar because we don't have the data to see them.
That's something to think about for sure.
So this brings us back to the policy decision that started it all. Diverting water from the Salton Sea to meet the needs of San Diego.
Right.
Sounds like a classic case of unintended consequences.
It does. I mean, obviously the water diversion addressed real needs in San Diego, but it's a good reminder that even well-intentioned actions can have these ripple effects that we don't always anticipate. For sure. It really highlights how everything is interconnected, especially when it comes to water resources.
Absolutely.
But what I find really inspiring is how the community didn't just, sit back and complain. They took action, they gathered data, and now they're working towards solutions.
Yeah, they're incredible.
It's really a testament to the power of community engagement.
It is. They have a deep love for the Salton Sea, and they're determined to see it restored.
Speaking of solutions, let's shift gears a bit and talk about what can be done to address this shrinking lake dilemma.
Sure, there are a number of options being considered, each with its own set of challenges and benefits.
Okay, let's break it down.
So one of the most talked about options is importing water from other sources.
Okay, so essentially bringing in water from elsewhere to replenish the Salton Sea.
Exactly.
That makes sense on the surface, but wouldn't that just be shifting the problem somewhere else?
That's the big question, right?
And where would this extra water even come from?
Well, the most likely source would be the Colorado River. Yeah.
But, as we've already seen, that river's already heavily tapped.
Right.
So importing water would require massive infrastructure investment,
Yeah.
complex negotiations with other states and Mexico, who also rely on the Colorado River.
Right.
And, of course, careful consideration of the environmental impacts.
So it's not just as simple as piping in water from wherever.
Nope. It's a lot more complicated than that.
Okay. So what about other options, like things that focus on the lake itself?
Another approach is managing the exposed lake bed to reduce dust emissions.
So like covering it up or something?
Kind of. It
Mhm.
could involve things like covering the dry lake bed with vegetation or other materials to prevent the dust from becoming airborne.
I can imagine that would be a huge undertaking given the size of the Salton Sea.
Oh, absolutely. It would be massive.
Yeah.
And it would require ongoing maintenance,
Right.
making sure the materials can withstand that harsh desert environment.
Yeah, for sure.
And then, of course, there's the question of cost.
Yeah, money always seems to be a factor. Always. These solutions don't come cheap.
Okay, so importing water is complicated and expensive, and managing the exposed lake bed is also complicated and expensive.
Pretty much.
Are there any solutions that kind of, address both the water supply and the dust problem at the same time?
Well, there are some pretty innovative ideas out there. Some researchers are looking into creating wetlands around the shrinking shoreline.
Wetlands, interesting. How would that work?
So the wetlands would provide habitats for wildlife, which is great.
Yeah,
But they could also help filter out pollutants from the agricultural runoff.
so a two-for-one solution.
Exactly.
That sounds promising. Are there any downsides to that approach?
Well, creating wetlands in that environment is tricky.
I bet.
It requires careful planning and management to make sure they actually thrive,
Right.
And they wouldn't completely solve the water shortage issue.
Ah, okay.
So it would likely need to be combined with other strategies.
Got it. So it seems like there's no magic bullet here.
Yeah.
It's going to take a combination of approaches to tackle this complex problem.
That's right.
But what's really encouraging is that the community is actively involved in finding these solutions.
Oh, absolutely. Their role is crucial.
Can you tell me more about their involvement? Like, what are they doing specifically?
Well, they're the ones who are living with the consequences of this shrinking lake every day, right?
Right.
So they're organizing, they're advocating for change, and they're working directly with researchers to find the best solutions.
That's amazing.
It's really a testament to the power of community engagement when people come together to tackle a problem head on.
It's inspiring to see them taking ownership of the issue rather than just waiting for someone else to fix it.
Yeah, for sure.
This bullying mapping project is a perfect example of that proactive spirit.
Totally.
And their efforts are actually having an impact, right?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
In what way?
Well, they've brought national attention to this whole Salton Sea crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and they're pushing for action from government agencies and policymakers.
So they're not just talking about it, they're actually making things happen.
Exactly. They're making their voices heard.
Their dedication to living next to a Salton Sea they're proud of. That's a powerful statement.
It is. And it's important to remember that the Salton Sea isn't just some isolated body of water.
That's right.
It plays a vital role in the region's ecosystem.
It's a crucial stop for migratory birds, right?
Exactly, on the Pacific Flyway. And it supports all sorts of other wildlife, too.
And beyond the ecological importance, did the Salton Sea also have, economic value at one point?
It did. It was a pretty big tourist destination back in the day.
Right.
But, the shrinking lake and the health concerns, it's really taken a toll on those industries.
So the stakes are high here, not just for the environment, but for the people and the economies that depend on the Salton Sea.
Absolutely. Finding a sustainable solution is critical.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground here,
We have.
but I think we need to take a break. Okay, so before the break, we were talking about some of the challenges facing the Salton Sea and some of the potential solutions that are being explored. And it sounds like there are no easy answers here.
No, not really. It's a very complex situation with a lot of moving parts.
Right. So let's dive back into those potential solutions. You mentioned importing water as one option, but It sounds like that comes with its own set of challenges.
It does. I mean, on paper, it seems like a straightforward solution, right? Bring in water from somewhere else to replenish the lake. But the reality is much more complicated.
So it's not just a matter of finding a source of water and building a pipeline.
Not even close. First of all, you have to find a source of water that's actually available and that you have the legal right to use.
Right. And as we talked about before the break, the most likely source would be the Colorado River, but that's already heavily overallocated.
Exactly. So even if you could get the water rights, you'd be taking it away from someone else, potentially creating a whole new set of problems.
It's like a giant game of water dominoes.
Kind of. And then there's the cost of building the infrastructure to transport the water, which would be astronomical. We're talking about hundreds of miles of pipelines, pumping stations, and all the associated environmental impacts.
It's starting to sound like importing water might not be the most feasible option.
Well, it's definitely not a quick fix.
Okay, so what about other options that focus more on the lake itself, like managing the exposed lake bed to reduce dust emissions?
That's another approach that's being explored. The idea is to basically cover the dry lake bed with something to prevent the dust from becoming airborne.
Like a giant blanket.
Sort of. They're looking at various materials, from vegetation to gravel to even synthetic fabrics.
I imagine that would be a massive undertaking, given the sheer size of the Salton Sea.
It would be an enormous project, no doubt about it. And it would require constant maintenance to make sure the covering stays in place and doesn't degrade over time.
And I'm guessing it wouldn't be cheap either.
You got it. These large-scale environmental remediation projects always come with a hefty price tag.
It seems like every solution we've discussed so far has its own set of drawbacks. Is there anything out there that seems particularly promising?
Well, there are some researchers who are working on some really innovative ideas.
Like what?
One that I find particularly intriguing is the concept of creating wetlands around the shrinking shoreline.
Wetlands. How would that help?
Well, wetlands are natural filters. They can absorb and break down pollutants, so they could potentially help mitigate the problem of agricultural runoff.
That's interesting. So it would be like creating a natural buffer zone around the lake.
Exactly. And on top of that, wetlands are great habitats for wildlife.
So it could be a win-win for both the environment and the ecosystem.
That's the idea. But of course, there are still challenges. Creating wetlands in that harsh desert environment isn't easy. It requires careful planning and management to make sure they thrive.
And I imagine it would be a long-term project.
It would. You can't just build a wetland overnight and expect it to solve all your problems. It takes time for these ecosystems to establish themselves and start functional effectively.
And I'm guessing wetlands wouldn't solve the problem of the shrinking lake itself, right?
Not entirely. They could help slow the process down and mitigate some of the negative consequences, but they wouldn't address the underlying issue of water scarcity.
So it seems like any solution to the Salton Sea crisis is going to require a multi-pronged approach.
Absolutely. There's no silver bullet here. It's going to take a combination of strategies working together to make a real difference.
But what I find really encouraging is that the community isn't just sitting back and waiting for someone else to fix it. They're actively involved in finding solutions.
Yeah, they're really leading the charge.
And it's not just about protesting or raising awareness. They're actually getting their hands dirty, so to speak, and working on practical solutions.
Exactly. They're partnering with researchers, they're advocating for policy changes, and they're even doing things like that balloon mapping project to gather data and document the changes happening to the lake.
It's really inspiring to see people taking ownership of the environmental challenges facing their community.
It is, and I think it's a model for how we should approach environmental problems in general. It can't just be left to scientists and policymakers. We all have a role to play.
And sometimes the most impactful solutions come from the people who are closest to the problem.
Absolutely. They have a unique understanding of the local context and the specific challenges that need to be addressed.
So what can our listeners do to support the efforts to save the Salton Sea?
Well, one of the most important things is to stay informed about the issue. The more people who are aware of the Salton Sea and the challenges it's facing, the more pressure there will be to find solutions.
And how can people stay informed? Are there any specific resources you recommend?
There are a number of great organizations working on the Salton Sea issue. The Salton Sea Authority is a good place to start. They have a lot of information on their website about the history of the lake, the current challenges, and the various restoration efforts that are underway.
And I imagine there are probably local groups that people can get involved with as well.
Oh yeah, there are tons of local groups doing amazing work. Just do a quick search online and you'll find plenty of opportunities to get involved.
And even if you don't live near the Salton Sea, You can still make a difference by supporting organizations that are working on water conservation and environmental protection in general.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
The Salton Sea story is a reminder that we're all connected to our environment, and that even seemingly small actions can have ripple effects.
That's a great point. And it's something we should all keep in mind as we go about our daily lives.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Thanks again for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy talking about the Salton Sea, even if it's a bit of a bittersweet topic.
I understand. It's a place with a rich history and a lot of ecological and cultural significance, but it's also facing some very serious challenges.
It is. But I'm still hopeful that we can find a way to restore the Salton Sea to its former glory, or at least a semblance of it.
I share your hope. And I think the efforts of the local community are a testament to the fact that even in the face of daunting environmental problems, people can come together and make a difference.
Absolutely. Never underestimate the power of people who are passionate about protecting their environment.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's been an enlightening conversation. And hopefully it's inspired some of you to learn more about the Salton Sea and the many other environmental challenges facing our world.
Yeah, it really is amazing to see a community come together like that to protect something they care about.
You know, it's kind of like a reminder that we all have a role to play in protecting our environment, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just about, big sweeping policy changes.
Right.
It's about the choices we make every day.
Exactly. Like, even small things can make a difference.
Yeah, for sure.
Like being mindful of our water usage or reducing our waste or supporting sustainable businesses.
All of that adds up.
This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. We've learned about the unintended consequences of, like, water policies, the innovative spirit of a community facing an environmental crisis, and the potential for citizen science to actually drive real solutions.
It's a really powerful story.
Yeah, it really is. It kind of makes you realize that even seemingly small decisions can have these huge ripple effects that we don't always anticipate.
That's a great point. And it's something we should all be more mindful of in our own lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who've been following along on this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you'd want them to remember about the Salton Sea?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we all have a responsibility to be stewards of our environment.
Yeah.
And that means understanding the interconnectedness of everything and making choices that are sustainable for the long haul.
That's so important. And it's not just about protecting the environment for its own sake.
Right.
It's about protecting it for ourselves and for future generations.
Exactly. We all depend on a healthy environment for our survival and well-being.
Well said. Well, this deep dive into the Salton Sea has been a fascinating journey. We've learned about the challenges, the complexities, and the inspiring efforts of a community determined to protect their beloved lake.
Yeah, they're truly an inspiration.
But most importantly, I think it's given us all a renewed sense of hope. Hope that through collaboration, innovation, and a commitment to sustainability, we can find solutions to even the most daunting environmental problems.
I agree. There's still a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of reason for optimism.
And I think the Salton Sea story is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
Even in the face of adversity, there's always hope.
Absolutely.
Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive into the Salton Sea.